My father-in-law walked into my kitchen without knocking, set a manila envelope on my granite island like he was dealing a hand of cards, and told me I could sign it tonight for $40,000, or I could fight him in court with a lawyer I couldn't afford. Then he smiled, not a cruel smile. That was the part that took me years to understand. Desmond Sinclair never looked cruel doing any of this. He looked like a man solving a problem. Efficient. Almost kind about it, the way you'd be kind explaining to a child that Santa Claus isn't real. "I know this is hard to hear, Margaret," he said, "but you and I both know you were never going to be in this family forever. Nathaniel's ready for a real future. I'd like to make this easy on everyone, including you. I want you to see that kitchen the way I still see it, because I've come to believe the details of a room matter more than people give them credit for." It was a good kitchen, marble I'd chosen myself, a window over the sink looking out on a garden I'd planted and tended for 2 decades, a chalkboard by the pantry where I still had, in my own handwriting, a grocery list from 3 days earlier, half of it crossed off, the ordinary residue of an ordinary life I had no idea was about to end that same evening. I think about that grocery list more than almost anything else from that night. Milk, coffee filters, Nathaniel's blood pressure medication, a refill I'd never get around to picking up, because by the time anyone thought to ask, it wasn't my job to remember it anymore. I looked down at the envelope. Then I looked at him, 81 years old, silver hair combed the same way it had been combed in every photograph of him for 40 years. A camel coat he hadn't bothered to unbutton because he didn't plan on staying long enough to need to. 24 years of my life were sitting on that counter in a manila envelope, and he thought it would take me one evening to sign them away. "You're right," I said. "I can't afford a lawyer like the one you've got on retainer." He nodded, satisfied, already reaching to button his coat. "But I don't need one like yours," I said. "I have something better. I have a brother." I want you to sit with that word for a second, because I hadn't said it out loud to anyone in this family in 24 years. Not once. Not at a single Thanksgiving, not at either of my son's graduations, not the year Desmond stood up at a Rotary Club dinner and said, in front of 300 people, that he'd always admired how I'd built a life without leaning on anybody's name. He'd meant it as a compliment. He had no idea what he was actually complimenting me for hiding. Desmond's hand stopped on the second button of his coat. Something in my voice must have caught him, because for just a second, one single second in 24 years, I watched Desmond Sinclair look uncertain. Here's what I need you to understand before I go any further. 3 things happened in the 60 seconds after I said that word, and I'm going to make you wait for all 3 of them, because that's exactly how long I made him wait. Who was my brother? What had I kept hidden from this family for a quarter of a century, in a house full of people who prided themselves on knowing everyone's business in this town? And why, out of everything Desmond Sinclair could have said to provoke me that night, had he chosen the one word, afford, that was about to end him? My name is Margaret Ashford Sinclair. Most people who actually know me call me Maggie, and I'll ask you to do the same, because Margaret is the name Desmond used whenever he wanted to remind me I'd married into something bigger than myself. I'm 54 years old, and I run a design firm on the coast of Georgia called Ashford and Foster, weddings, mostly, full home renovations the rest of the time. 15 years of work that never once needed anyone's name attached to it but my own. I met Nathaniel Sinclair 26 years ago, married him 2 years later, and spent every year after that building something inside that marriage Desmond never thought to ask me a single question about. That part of the story is coming. Right now, there's only one thing about myself you actually need before I tell you what happened next, because it's the reason Desmond Sinclair is, at this exact moment, the most surprised man in the state of Georgia. I come from money. Real money, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that pays for things quietly and never mentions the receipt. My father was a federal judge for 22 years. My older brother followed him into the law, into a career I'll explain properly once it actually starts to matter, and it is going to matter, more than either of us understood on the phone that night. I chose not to use any of it. Not because I was ashamed of my family. Because I was 28 years old, tired, bone-tired, of every single person deciding who I was before they'd spoken to me for 5 minutes, and I wanted, just once in my life, to build something entirely, unmistakably mine. So when I married into the Sinclair family, I let them believe exactly what they wanted to believe, that I'd come from nothing, that my parents had passed years ago, that I had no siblings worth mentioning. It wasn't even really lying in my head. It was omission, and I told myself omission was a kind of privacy. Desmond never once asked a follow-up question. That should have told me something about him from the very beginning, a man that thorough about everyone else's finances, never once wondered where his son's quiet, capable wife had actually come from. He simply decided I didn't matter enough to investigate. That mistake is the reason you're hearing this story at all. For 24 years, I ran the operational spine of Sinclair Development Group, and my name was on none of it. Nathaniel had the vision, or claimed to. Desmond had the capital and the connections, 4 decades of them, every zoning board member and county commissioner in 3 counties owing him a favor or fearing one. What neither of them had in the early years was the discipline to actually run a company, the contracts, the vendor negotiations, the payroll, the 1,000 small decisions that separate a development firm that survives its first decade from the ones that don't. I did that, quietly at a card table in our first house, then a proper desk once we could afford one, then eventually from an office 3 doors down from Nathaniel's, doing work that never had my name attached to it because Desmond had made it clear, gently but completely, in the first year of our marriage, that the company was a Sinclair matter, and I was welcome to help however I liked, as long as I understood I was helping. I understood. I helped anyway because I loved my husband, and because I believed for a very long time that the work spoke for itself even when my name didn't. There was one piece of paper that mattered. 11 years into the marriage, after I'd single-handedly restructured the company's vendor contracts and saved them from a lawsuit that would have bankrupted them, Nathaniel sat across from me at our kitchen table, this same kitchen, the one Desmond would stand in years later dropping an envelope, and told me he wanted to make it official. A 25% equity stake, on paper, in recognition of what I'd built. "I'll get the paperwork drawn up," he said. "I promise you, Maggie, you've earned this 10 times over." He never got the paperwork drawn up. There was always a reason, a closing that needed attention first, an accountant who needed a quarter to finish something else, Desmond who just needed a little time to get comfortable with the idea. I remember asking about it directly once at the 2-year mark, standing in his office doorway with a stack of vendor invoices I'd just finished reconciling. "I haven't forgotten," he told me, not looking up from his monitor. "I promise you, Maggie, the second things settle down with Dad, I'm making it official. You have my word." Years passed. I stopped asking, the way you stop asking about anything that makes the person you love flinch every time you bring it up. I told myself the marriage was the real equity. I told myself he'd get to it eventually. He never did. And that omission, his, this time, not mine, was about to become the single most important fact in my entire life. What I didn't know, sitting in that kitchen 24 years in, was that Desmond had recently found something he considered a far better solution to his son's business than a wife who'd built half of it. Her name was Isabel Marchetti, 31 years old, daughter of a commercial capital investor named Victor Marchetti, who was sitting on exactly the kind of money Sinclair Development Group needed for its biggest project yet, a luxury resort development along a stretch of coastline called Egret Cove, the kind of project that would triple the size of everything Desmond had built in 40 years. All Desmond needed to close that deal was a son who was cleanly, quietly, inexpensively unmarried. The end of my marriage didn't come with a scene. It came with silence, which I've come to understand is how the men in that family preferred to do everything difficult. Nathaniel stopped coming home on a Tuesday in October. Not dramatically, no suitcase by the door, no scene in the driveway. He simply started staying at the office later and later, then started staying at a corporate apartment the company kept for visiting investors, then stopped coming home at all, communicating through the kind of clipped, apologetic texts men send when they've already made a decision and are waiting for someone else to do the hard part of ending it out loud. I want to tell you I was blindsided, but that wouldn't be honest. I'd felt it coming for months, a distance in him, a new sharpness in the way Desmond looked at me at family dinners, a name, Isabel, that started appearing in conversation with a little too much warmth for a business associate's daughter. I didn't confront it directly, and I've asked myself since whether that was patience or cowardice. I think, honestly, it was some of both. Desmond was the one who finally came to say it out loud, which told me everything about who was actually running this decision. You already know how that particular conversation went: the envelope, the $40,000, the 30 days. The word afford dropped on me like it was a kindness. What I haven't told you yet is what it cost me to hand it back to him. 24 years of never once mentioning my brother inside that house, spent in about 4 seconds, the moment I finally needed him more than I needed my own pride. I'd protected that omission through funerals, through Christmases, through every single dinner where Desmond congratulated himself on how well he'd read me. And I gave it up standing at my own kitchen island, watching a man who'd already started buttoning his coat back up in relief. He left 10 minutes later, confidence only slightly dented, already composing in his head whatever version of that evening he planned to tell his lawyer. The second his car cleared my driveway, my hands started shaking so hard I had to set my phone down twice before I could dial the number. It rang twice. A voice I hadn't heard use my name in almost 2 years answered on the second ring, already sharp, already alert, the way he'd sounded every single time I was in trouble as a kid. "Maggie, what's wrong?" "Marcus," I said, "I need my brother." I have to back up here, just for a moment, because you need to understand who was actually on the other end of that phone call, and why it had been 2 years since I'd let myself dial it. My brother Marcus is 58 years old, and what he actually does for a living isn't something I can explain to you in one sentence, not because it's complicated, but because I've spent so many years being careful never to say it out loud that the words still don't come easily. I'll tell you the rest of it properly once it starts to matter, and it's going to matter a great deal sooner than either of us expected that night. For now, here's all you need. Marcus spent 2 decades in a Marine Corps uniform, prosecuting the kind of financial crimes that ruin thousands of lives quietly, one forged signature at a time, and when he finally traded that uniform for a desk in state government, the sort of men who'd never once had to worry about consequences suddenly found reasons to return his calls fast. We hadn't spoken much in 2 years, and the reason for that silence sits on me more than it does on him. After our father died, 6 years ago, there was a fight over the estate, not really about money, though money was the excuse, but about a choice I'd made a long time before that. I remember it exactly. We were standing in the church parking lot after the service, both of us still in black, my father's flag folded into a triangle in Marcus's hands because he'd been the one to accept it from the honor guard. Marcus turned to me before I'd even reached my car and said, "Dad talked to me about you," near the end. "Did you know that?" "About what?" "About Nathaniel. About Desmond. He asked me once, maybe a year before he died, whether I thought you were happy, and when I told him I honestly didn't know, he said, she stopped telling any of us anything a long time ago, and I think she did it so she wouldn't have to hear us say what we actually think." Marcus's jaw was tight, grief and frustration tangled together in a way I recognized, because I felt the exact same tangle standing across from him. He never said it to your face, because he didn't want to lose you the way losing you seemed to be the only outcome of ever being honest with you. I don't want to make that same mistake. I think you married a man who's never once had to earn anything in his life, into a family that treats you like staff with better furniture. And I think you built an entire fortress around yourself so nobody could ever tell you that to your face. I didn't ask for your opinion of my marriage, Marcus. "I know you didn't," he said. "That's exactly the problem. You stopped asking anyone for anything a long time ago, including help, and I'm tired of standing at our father's funeral watching you hold yourself together alone because you've decided that's the only way to prove you don't need any of us." I told my brother that day that I hadn't asked for his opinion of my marriage. He told me that was exactly the problem, that I'd stopped asking anyone for anything, including help, a long time before that conversation, and he was tired of watching me do it. We didn't speak again, not really, for 2 years. Birthday texts. A cordial appearance at a cousin's wedding. The particular polite distance of 2 people who love each other and don't know how to stop being right at each other long enough to say so. "Maggie," he said again, into the silence I'd let stretch too long on that first call. "Talk to me." "They took everything, Marcus. My voice broke on his name in a way I hadn't let it break in front of anyone in years. Desmond and Nathaniel. There's another woman. There's a settlement. He's never putting my name on 24 years of work, and Desmond just stood in my kitchen and told me I couldn't afford a lawyer to fight his son. There was a pause on the line, long enough that I heard a chair roll back somewhere, papers shifting, a door closing. He said what? He said I couldn't afford a lawyer. My brother laughed. It wasn't a warm laugh. It was low, and it went on a beat too long, and it was the exact sound I remembered from every single time, growing up, someone had made the mistake of underestimating him in front of me. He actually said that, Marcus said, to Judge Harlan Ashford's daughter. I hadn't heard our father's full name spoken out loud in that voice in years, and something in me finally cracked open, quietly, in my own kitchen, 24 years of careful omission collapsing all at once. Good, my brother said. Let him believe it. Pack whatever you need for the next 2 weeks and don't sign one single piece of paper before you talk to me again. He wanted a divorce, Maggie. I'm going to make sure he gets a war. I moved into a rented condo 2 miles from the house I'd decorated with my own hands. And for 3 weeks, I let the entire town believe I was exactly what Desmond Sinclair had decided I was, a woman who'd taken her settlement quietly and gone home to lick her wounds. It was, without question, the hardest acting job of my life. My business partner, Renee Foster, was the only person outside my brother who knew the truth, and only because she found me at 2 in the morning on the third night, sitting on the floor of my new kitchen, surrounded by unpacked boxes, going through 24 years of old emails on my laptop looking for anything that might matter. You're not allowed to fall apart, Renee said, sitting down on the floor next to me without being asked, still in the cardigan she'd clearly thrown over pajamas. Not because I don't think you've earned it. Because I've watched you build 2 businesses out of nothing, and I refuse to believe the same woman is going to let that man win by doing absolutely nothing wrong except trusting her husband. I'm not doing nothing, I told her, and then, because she was the only person I could say it to, I told her everything Marcus, the bureau, the forensic team already combing through records I didn't even know existed. Renee listened without interrupting, which from Renee is its own kind of miracle, and when I finished, she reached over and closed my laptop gently. Then let your brother do his job tonight, she said. And let me remind you of something you told a bride 2 years ago, the one who wanted to cancel her whole wedding 40 minutes before the ceremony because her mother-in-law said something cruel about the flowers. You told her the worst thing she could do was let one ugly moment write the whole story. Take your own advice, Maggie. I did mostly. I answered Nathaniel's occasional check in texts with short, deflated replies designed to keep him comfortable. I just need time. I don't want to fight this. While 3 states away, a team of forensic accountants I'd never met began quietly pulling apart 11 years of Sinclair Development Group's financial records. Starting with one specific question, my brother had asked them to answer first. I have 2 grown children. Our daughter Claire is 26, a labor and delivery nurse in Charlotte. Our son Owen is 29, and until 3 weeks earlier he'd spent 6 years as a project manager at Sinclair Development Group, hired by his grandfather straight out of business school. I want you to hold on to his name, because everything that was about to happen to me was about to happen to him too, in a slower, quieter way. Owen called me that same week, his voice tight in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager caught in some minor lie. Mom, Grandpa said you're taking a settlement. $40,000 and the assets stay with Dad. Are you actually okay with that? I wanted, more than almost anything else in those 3 weeks, to tell my son the truth. I didn't. Marcus had been clear, the fewer people who knew, the smaller the chance of a leak reaching Desmond before the evidence was ready, and Owen worked 40 feet down the hall from his grandfather's office 5 days a week. I'm figuring things out, I told him instead, hating every syllable of it. I don't want you caught in the middle of this, sweetheart. Just focus on your work. Grandpa says you never really cared about the business, Owen said, and I heard something defensive creep into his voice, the particular tone of a young man repeating words that weren't originally his. That you were happy just doing the books quietly and letting Dad run things. Is that true? I closed my eyes and thought about 11 years of vendor contracts with my initials in the margins, filed under Nathaniel's name. Is that what you think, Owen? Really? There was a long pause. I don't know what I think anymore, he admitted, quieter now. I just know Grandpa's never lied to me before. I didn't have an answer for that yet, standing in a rented condo 3 weeks into the worst month of my life. I only had a promise to myself that I intended to keep, that whatever it cost me, my son was going to hear the truth eventually, and he was going to hear it from evidence, not from me asking him to simply take my word over his grandfather's. I hung up that night and sat with my back against the kitchen cabinets for a long time, and for some reason it was Nathaniel at 28 I kept picturing, not Nathaniel now. I'd met him at a lighting trade show in Savannah, of all places, cornered at a booth selling reclamation hardware, laughing at himself for not knowing the first thing about picking fixtures for a listing his father needed staged by the weekend. I just know it needs to look expensive, he'd said, and something about the honesty of that line had disarmed me completely. I liked him. I want to be honest about that. Even now, I liked him for a long time, and some small, stubborn part of me still does, which is exactly what made everything that followed so much harder to carry than plain anger would have been. It is a strange thing, hating what a person became while still remembering, clearly, the version of him that made you say yes in the first place. I didn't let myself sit in that memory for long. There wasn't room for it yet, not with a forensic team 3 states away and a son who thought his mother had rolled over without a fight. Find the paperwork, Marcus told me, the second week on one of our nightly calls. The equity stake Nathaniel promised you. If it exists anywhere, a draft, an email, a lawyer's file note, I want it. And Maggie, I need you to think hard. Did you ever sign anything you don't fully remember signing? Anything Nathaniel or Desmond asked you to sign as a formality? I thought about it for 3 days before the answer surfaced, the way these things do, usually at 4 in the morning. 2 years earlier, during a stretch when I was in Charleston for 6 weeks helping my Aunt Corrine recover from hip surgery, a courier had shown up at her door with an overnight envelope from Nathaniel, and I remembered the exact tiredness of that particular Tuesday, Corrine asleep in the next room, physical therapy at 7 the next morning, my phone buzzing with his call before I'd even signed for the package. It's just cleaning up some old paperwork with the accountant, he'd said, his voice easy, unhurried, the voice of a man asking his wife to do something as small as picking up milk. Nothing that affects us. Just sign the last page and overnight it back. I need it before Friday's closing. I remember standing at Corrine's kitchen counter, flipping to the signature line without reading the 11 pages in front of it, because I was exhausted, because Corrine needed her medication in 20 minutes, and because in 22 years of marriage, Nathaniel had never once given me a reason to read something he handed me twice. I signed it, sealed the envelope, and went back to counting out pills at my aunt's kitchen table, and I did not think about that document again for 2 years, until my brother asked me a question that made my hands go cold at 4 in the morning in a rented condo 300 miles away. I have replayed that Tuesday more times than I can count since. I don't think Nathaniel forged anything with his own hand that day. Farah's team eventually confirmed the signature itself was genuinely mine, which was, in its own bleak way, almost worse. He hadn't needed to forge me. He'd simply needed me tired and trusting and 300 miles from anyone who might have told me to read past the signature line. There was something I told Marcus 2 years ago. I don't even remember what it said. Do you remember who notarized it? I didn't, and that question, more than anything else in that entire call, is the one that kept me up until sunrise. Her name was Farah Solis, a senior forensic investigator in Marcus's bureau who had, in her words when we finally met in person, spent 15 years finding the one page in 10,000 that a smart, careful man was hoping nobody would ever pull. She found it in the 4th week. The document I'd signed at my aunt's kitchen table wasn't a cleanup of old paperwork. It was a spousal waiver of business interest, a legal instrument stating, in language dense enough that I'd have needed a law degree to catch it on a tired afternoon, that I relinquished any current or future claim to equity, profit share, or ownership in Sinclair Development Group, in exchange for continued financial support during the marriage. I had never been offered anything in exchange for it. There had been no negotiation, no lawyer present, no explanation beyond cleaning up paperwork. And the notary stamp on the bottom belonged to a woman named Paula Winslow, who, when Farah's team quietly contacted her under the pretense of a routine license audit, had no record in her notary log of ever notarizing a document for a Margaret Sinclair. The stamp's real, Farah told me and Marcus, over a call I sat in on from Renee's back porch, the only place in my new life that still felt like it was actually mine. The notarization isn't. Someone had access to her stamp, or a very good forgery of it. Either way, that waiver is fraudulent on its face, which means it never should have carried any legal weight to begin with. It should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like the floor tilting a second time, because it meant Nathaniel hadn't simply let an old promise quietly expire through neglect and cowardice, the story I'd been telling myself for 2 years to make the silence easier to live with. Someone had actively manufactured a document to erase my claim, and manufactured it specifically during the 6 weeks I was 300 miles away caring for someone else's family. "Can I ask you something?" I said, before she went on. "How does someone build a case like this without the person on the other end knowing they're being watched? Nathaniel still thinks I'm sitting in a rented condo feeling sorry for myself." "Patience, mostly," Farah said, and I could hear something almost like warmth in her voice, the particular satisfaction of someone who loves the quiet, unglamorous part of her job. People who commit financial fraud almost never think anyone's smart enough or patient enough to actually trace it. That overconfidence is the whole reason cases like this get made. Every subpoena we file goes through channels that don't tip off the target until we're ready. Right now, as far as Sinclair Development Group knows, you're exactly what they think you are, a quiet woman who signed a waiver and went home. That's the most valuable thing you have right now, Maggie. Nobody over there knows yet that it isn't true. There's more, Farah said, and I heard Marcus go very still on the other end of the line, the particular stillness he gets right before he tells me something he's already decided how to use. We pulled 3 years of the company's banking records. "Maggie, your husband has been quietly moving a lot of money somewhere he didn't want anyone finding it, hidden behind a couple of shell companies, all of it eventually landing in one place, a coastal development project called Egret Cove." "What's Egret Cove?" "That," Marcus said, "is what we're about to find out. And I think you should know, before we go any further, that this waiver you signed wasn't really about protecting the company from a messy divorce. The timing's wrong for that. This was drafted and executed a full 2 years before Desmond ever brought up Isabel Marchetti's name. Whatever this is about, Maggie, it was never really about you leaving the marriage. You were just the easiest obstacle to remove on the way to something bigger." I sat on Renee's porch in the last of the November light, and for the first time since that Tuesday in my kitchen, I understood that this had never been a story about a bad marriage ending badly. It was a story about a project, and a plan that had needed me gone long before Desmond ever admitted it to my face. I found out what Egret Cove actually was from a woman I'd never met, 3 weeks later, sitting in her kitchen with a cup of tea going cold between us. Her name was Adele Merrick. She was 74 years old, a retired school teacher who'd lived in a modest, weathered cottage on a bluff overlooking the marsh for 41 years, in a stretch of coastline that Sinclair Development Group had spent the last 3 years quietly, patiently assembling parcel by parcel for what internal documents Farah's team had recovered called, with the kind of bloodless corporate cheer that makes my skin crawl to this day, the Egret Cove Coastal Residences. Marcus had asked me to make the first contact myself, not one of his investigators. A woman talking to a woman, he said, would get further faster than a state badge on a stranger's porch. I understood why the moment Adele opened her door and looked at me with the particular wariness of someone who has been disappointed by people in nice cars before. "You're Nathaniel Sinclair's wife," she said, "not a question." I told her. "I think you and I might have more in common than either of us wants." Her kitchen smelled like wood smoke and orange peel. A kettle going soft on a stove older than my own marriage, framed photographs crowding every flat surface, a man in a Navy uniform, decades of grandchildren at various ages, a porch under construction in a photograph gone the color of weak tea. She caught me looking at that last one. "Walt built that porch the summer before he died," she said, 31 years ago now. "Took him 4 months because he insisted on doing every board himself, even the ones I told him to just hire someone for." She smiled, small and private, the smile of someone who has learned to carry grief the way you carry something heavy you've simply gotten used to holding. I sit out there most mornings still. Coffee first, tea in the evening. It's the only place in this house that still feels like exactly what it was supposed to be. And over 2 cups of tea, she told me a story I recognized in its bones, even though every detail was different from mine. A generous buyout offer that turned out to be a fraction of her land's actual value. An appraisal that mysteriously failed to mention a soil contamination report the company itself had commissioned and buried. A nephew of a neighbor down the road who'd shown up with paperwork granting himself power of attorney over an elderly widower's affairs 2 properties over. Paperwork the widower, it turned out, had no memory of ever signing. "They don't threaten you," Adele said, wrapping both hands around her mug like she needed the warmth of it. "That's the thing nobody believes until it happens to them. They're polite. They're patient. They just keep coming back with slightly worse numbers and slightly more paperwork until you're too tired to keep saying no. I held out 2 years longer than anyone else on this stretch of road. I'm the last one left who hasn't sold." "Why haven't you sold?" She looked at me for a long moment, and something in her face hardened into the exact expression I imagine I'd been wearing in my own kitchen the night Desmond Sinclair called me easy. "Because my husband built that porch with his own 2 hands the summer before he died," she said, "and I decided a long time ago that the only way anyone was getting this house was over my dead body, and I intend to make that as inconvenient for them as humanly possible." I drove home from Adele Merrick's cottage with my hands tight on the wheel, doing math I hadn't let myself do yet. If Egret Cove required this stretch of coastline assembled, and Adele was the last holdout, and Desmond needed serious new capital to actually build the resort he'd been dreaming about for a decade, capital that a commercial investor like Victor Marchetti could provide contingent, I now understood with total clarity, on his daughter marrying cleanly into a company that wasn't tangled up in an ugly divorce or an inconvenient wife with equity claims. Then I hadn't been an obstacle to a marriage ending. I'd been an obstacle to a deal closing. Desmond hadn't been choosing Isabel over me because he preferred her. He'd been clearing the last variable out of a financial equation, the same way he'd apparently been clearing Adele Merrick off her bluff for 2 patient years. I called Marcus from my own driveway before I'd even gone inside. "I know what Egret Cove is," I told him. "And Marcus, it's not just me. There's a whole road of people he's been doing this to. An old woman named Adele Merrick has been holding him off for 2 years by herself, and I don't think she has any idea how much bigger this actually is." There was a long pause on the line, and when my brother spoke again, his voice had shifted into a register I recognized from every story I'd ever heard about his career. Not my brother anymore, exactly. The version of him that had spent 20 years making people like Desmond Sinclair regret underestimating what quiet actually meant. "Then we're not building a divorce case anymore," Marcus said. "We're building a pattern case. And Maggie, I need you to understand what that means. Once this becomes about more than your marriage, I can't fully control how far it goes, or how fast, or how much it costs Nathaniel. Are you sure you want to open that door?" I thought about Adele Merrick's hands wrapped around a cooling mug of tea, telling me she intended to make her own eviction as inconvenient as humanly possible. "Open it," I said, "all the way." While I was learning the true shape of what I was actually fighting, Desmond and Nathaniel were celebrating. I heard about the dinner through Renee, who heard about it through a client who'd been seated 2 tables away at the Magnolia Bay Yacht Club, in the private dining room Desmond had used for every major closing in 30 years. Nathaniel had brought Isabel. Desmond had brought half the county's commercial real estate circle, and according to Renee's client, he'd spent a good portion of the evening explaining, with the easy warmth of a man who has never once doubted his own version of events, how his son had handled a difficult family transition with real grace, and how the old chapter was closing quietly, cleanly, with no lawyers, no drama, no mess for anyone to clean up. He'd apparently raised a toast, near the end of the meal, to new beginnings and clean ledgers, a phrase Renee's client repeated to her with a small, uncomfortable laugh, not fully understanding, at the time, exactly how literally Desmond meant it. Victor Marchetti had been there too, seated at Desmond's right hand, nodding along with the particular polite reserve of a man who hadn't yet decided whether he liked what he was hearing. A detail I turned over in my mind for weeks afterward, wondering how much of that evening had actually been for Nathaniel and Isabel at all, and how much of it had simply been Desmond auditioning his own confidence in front of the one man whose money he still needed. Isabel, by every account, had looked lovely and said very little. I want a pause here, because it would be easy to make her the villain of this next part, and I've promised myself I'm going to tell you the truth even when the truth is more complicated than the story people want to hear. Isabel Marchetti was 31 years old, the only daughter of a man who had built his fortune the same patient, unsentimental way Desmond had built his, and I don't believe, sitting where I sit now, that she ever fully understood the shape of what she was walking into. She'd been told a story, too, that Nathaniel's marriage was already over in every way that mattered, that the woman he'd been married to for 24 years had moved on gracefully, that she was stepping into an ending, not causing one. She was, in her own way, exactly what I had been at 28. A smart, capable woman who trusted the story she'd been handed by men who had every incentive to make sure she never asked too many follow-up questions. The town, meanwhile, was busy writing its own version of events, and in a place the size of Magnolia Bay, that version travels faster than any lawyer's letter. I started getting the look at the grocery store within 2 weeks, the particular blend of pity and judgment reserved for a wife who'd been traded in, dressed up as concern. A longtime client of mine, planning her daughter's engagement party, called to explore other design options, citing, when Renee pressed gently, some vague unease about family stability that had clearly reached her through the same gossip network that had once sent me casserole dishes when Nathaniel had his appendix out. I lost 2 events that month. Small ones, in the scheme of a business I'd spent 15 years building, but not painless, and not the last cost this fight was going to demand of me before it was over. What steadied me was a phone call from a woman named Delphine Aldrich, a longtime client, and, it turned out, someone with far sharper instincts than the yacht club crowd. She called me directly instead of letting rumor decide for her. I heard some things, she said, and I'd rather hear the actual shape of it from you than a version filtered through the marina gossip. So I told her. Not everything. Marcus had asked me to stay quiet about the investigation itself, but enough of the truth to let her understand exactly what kind of woman she was actually talking to. Well, she said, when I finished, that's not a story about a woman who got left behind. That's a story about a woman who's been quietly holding a company together for 24 years while everyone around her took the credit. I'll be doing my granddaughter's wedding with you in the spring, Maggie. I'd like that on the record, in case anyone asks. I cried a little after that call, the good kind, the kind that comes from being seen accurately after weeks of being seen through a funhouse mirror somebody else built. It wasn't enough to stop the whispering entirely, but it was enough to remind me that not everyone in Magnolia Bay had already decided who the villain of this story was. Owen found me the week after that dinner, meeting me at a diner off the highway instead of anywhere in town, which told me on its own how carefully he was starting to weigh his own loyalties. Grandpa asked me to keep an eye on you, he said, stirring coffee he wasn't drinking. His words. He said you might be more fragile than you're letting on, and he wanted me checking in, reporting back if anything seemed off. Mom, that felt wrong the second he said it, and I couldn't figure out why until I was already in the car driving here. What did you tell him? That you seemed fine. Sad, but fine. He looked up at me, and for the first time in weeks, I saw something other than his grandfather's careful language in his face. He's not just checking on you because he's worried, is he? No, I said carefully. I don't think he is. Is there something I should know? Something about the business? His voice cracked slightly on the word business, 6 years of loyalty, and a mortgage he'd taken out against his own future salary sitting underneath the question. Because I've noticed things too, Mom. Numbers that don't line up the way Grandpa explains them. A consultant named Kessner who's never once been in the office but gets paid out of a fund I don't have access to. I told myself it wasn't my business to ask. It might become your business very soon, I told him, choosing every word carefully. I can't tell you more than that right now, Owen, and I need you to trust me on that the same way you've spent 6 years trusting your grandfather. I'm asking you to just keep doing your job, keep your eyes open, and not go looking for trouble on my behalf. can you do that?" He nodded slowly, and I watched my son drive away from that diner, carrying a question he hadn't fully known how to ask. The first crack forming in a loyalty Desmond had spent 6 years building, without ever once considering it, might not hold. Desmond, meanwhile, had no idea the ground under his celebration had already started to crack. 3 weeks after that dinner, his attorney filed a motion that told me, more clearly than anything else could have, exactly how confident he still was that he'd already won. Warren Kessler had represented Desmond Sinclair for as long as I'd been part of this family. A tall, unhurried man with the specific talent of making every aggressive legal maneuver sound like a reasonable courtesy between civilized people. The motion he filed in early December was, on its surface, almost polite. It asked the court to freeze my personal accounts, pending a full audit of irregularities in Sinclair Development Group's books during the period I'd served, unofficially, as its operations director. The filing suggested, in careful, lawyerly language that never quite committed to an outright accusation, that certain vendor payments and contract adjustments I'd authorized over the years warranted review for potential mismanagement, the implication being that if anyone's finances deserved scrutiny in this divorce, it was mine, not the company's. I read it standing in Renee's kitchen with my coffee going cold, and for one genuine moment, my hands shook the way they had the night Desmond first set that envelope on my counter. "They're trying to get ahead of it," Marcus said. When I called him, his voice flat and unimpressed in a way that did more to steady me than any reassurance would have. "Somebody at that company knows we're circling something. This is a preemptive strike. Maggie, paint you as the financially reckless one before we can paint them as the actual fraud. It's not a bad play. It's just not going to work because, unlike them, everything you ever did with that company's money is going to hold up under a real audit. And I already know that because my team's been living inside those books for 6 weeks. How do you know somebody tipped them off?" "Because this motion was filed 4 days after Farah's team formally requested Paula Winslow's notary log," Marcus said. "That's not a coincidence, Maggie. Somebody at that company, or close to it, knows exactly what we're looking for, and they're scared enough to swing first." "Do you think it was Desmond?" "I think Desmond's too careful to make a move like this without being sure it'll land," my brother said. "This has the shape of someone reacting out of fear rather than strategy, sloppy, rushed, more concerned with getting ahead of a story than actually winning a legal argument. Whoever tipped him off is scared of something specific, and I'd bet good money it isn't the company's books in general. It's this waiver. Somebody close to your husband knows exactly how bad that document is going to look once we finish pulling it apart, and they wanted to strike first, before we could." I sat with that for a long moment, turning over every name I could think of who might have known enough to be that frightened: an accountant, a paralegal, someone in the office who'd handled the original paperwork. I didn't land on the right answer until I was standing in that courthouse hallway 2 weeks later, and even then, it came from a place I hadn't expected it to. The hearing on Kessler's motion was set for the second week of December, and it would be the first time I'd stand in a courtroom across from Desmond Sinclair since this had started. I spent the 10 days before it the way I'd spent every day since that phone call in my kitchen: quiet, patient, letting them believe the version of me they'd already decided was true. I had no idea, walking into that hearing, that it would be the day I finally learned exactly who inside Sinclair Development Group had been frightened enough to reach for the phone first, and that the answer would matter far more than anything Warren Kessler said in that courtroom. The Magnolia County Courthouse is a squat brick building 3 blocks off the marina, the kind of building that has seen every divorce, every zoning dispute, and every small town scandal this county has produced for 80 years, and it did not feel, walking into it that morning, like it was about to see anything different. Desmond sat at the respondent's table in a gray suit, composed, almost bored, the posture of a man attending a formality. Nathaniel sat beside him, and I want to tell you honestly that he would not look at me, not out of cruelty, I don't think, but out of something closer to shame, a flicker of it crossing his face every time his eyes drifted my way and then found somewhere else to be. Marcus had sent one of his junior attorneys to argue the motion itself, a sharp young woman named Naomi Reyes, on the theory that his own presence should be saved for a moment that would matter more. She dismantled Kessler's filing in 11 efficient minutes, walking the judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Miriam Castellano, through 11 years of vendor contracts I'd negotiated, every one of them delivering savings the company's own records confirmed, none of them showing so much as a hint of the irregularities Kessler's filing had gestured at without ever quite naming. Counsel, Judge Castellano said, when Kessler tried to argue the audit should proceed regardless, as a precaution, I'm looking at a filing that alleges financial mismanagement without citing a single specific transaction. If your client has evidence of wrongdoing, I'd expect to see it attached. What I have in front of me looks like a motion filed to distract from something else. I'm denying it. I watched Desmond's jaw tighten, the first crack in that composed gray suit all morning. 2 rows back in the gallery, I spotted Owen sitting alone, still in his work clothes, having clearly slipped out of the office on some invented errand to see for himself what his mother's settlement actually looked like in a courtroom. He didn't approach either of us afterward. He just watched, arms crossed, something working itself out behind his eyes that I recognized, uncomfortably, as the exact expression I imagined I'd worn the night a man, in a linen coat, first set an envelope down in front of me. It was in the hallway afterward, gathering our things, that I found out how the motion had come to exist at all, and it wasn't Desmond who told me. It was Nathaniel, catching my arm gently as I passed him near the elevator, his voice low enough that his father, 3 steps ahead, didn't hear it. Maggie, can we talk, just for a minute? I should have walked away. Marcus would have told me to walk away. But 24 years doesn't disappear because a man stops coming home, and some part of me needed to hear whatever he'd been carrying around long enough that it had started showing on his face. Farah Solis' team called me 3 weeks ago, he said, asking about the waiver, about Paula Winslow. I panicked, Maggie. I told my father someone was asking questions because I didn't know what else to do, and he's the one who decided to file first. I didn't want this. I need you to know that. I didn't want any of this to go this far. You forged my signature on a document that erased 24 years of my life, Nathaniel, or you let someone do it for you. Which is it? He didn't answer, and the silence answered for him more completely than any explanation could have. I was drowning, he said instead. The company's been overextended on Egret Cove for 2 years. My father needed Marchetti's capital, and Marchetti wanted a clean, simple son-in-law, not a messy divorce hanging over the deal. I told myself I'd make it right with you eventually. I told myself you'd understand, once the project was stable, that none of it was really. He stopped himself before finishing the sentence, but I'd heard enough versions of it by then to fill in the rest on my own. That none of it was really about you. It was always about me, Nathaniel, I said. I was the only thing standing between your father and a clean sale. That's not nothing, that's everything. I walked away before he could answer, and I called Marcus from the courthouse steps, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. Nathaniel tipped him off, I said, after your team called about the waiver. And Marcus, he as good as told me the whole thing is about clearing me out of the way so Marchetti's money closes clean on Egret Cove. Then we're closer than I thought, my brother said, because a scared man who just admitted the plan out loud to his soon-to-be ex-wife is a scared man who's about to make more mistakes. Stay ready, Maggie. I think this moves faster from here. She found me, not the other way around, 2 weeks later, waiting outside my studio on a Thursday evening after my last client had gone, sitting in her car until she saw my lights go off. The way I imagined she'd rehearsed doing for days before she finally worked up the nerve. I know I have no right to ask you for anything, Isabel Marchetti said, standing on the sidewalk in a coat too thin for December, but I need 10 minutes, and I promise you it isn't what you think. I almost said no. I had every reason to say no. But something in her face, a kind of exhausted uncertainty I recognized from my own mirror 26 years earlier, back when I'd first walked into that church full of people who worked for a man I didn't understand yet, made me unlock the studio door instead and let her back in. My father's having second thoughts, she said, once we were sitting across from each other at my sample table, surrounded by fabric swatches for other people's weddings. About the capital for Egret Cove. Not because of you, exactly. Because of the due diligence his team ran last month, some inconsistencies in the environmental reports Sinclair Development submitted, things that didn't match county records. He asked Nathaniel about it directly, and Nathaniel's answer scared him more than the inconsistency did. What did Nathaniel say? That it was a formality that would sort itself out before closing. She said it with the exact flat, disbelieving tone I imagine I'd used once describing my own husband's promises about a piece of paperwork that never got filed. My father's spent 30 years in this business, Mrs. Sinclair. He knows what it sounds like when someone's asking him to fund a problem instead of a project. Why are you telling me this? She was quiet for a long moment, turning a swatch of pale blue linen over in her hands without seeming to notice she was doing it. Because 2 weeks ago, Desmond asked me to sign something, she said. A prenuptial agreement, which I expected. But also a second document, some kind of ownership acknowledgement for Egret Cove, structured so that if the deal closed after Nathaniel and I married, my father's capital contribution would convert into equity held jointly by Nathaniel and Desmond, with no protection for me if anything went wrong on the development side. I asked my own attorney to look at it before I signed anything, and he told me, very carefully, that it read like a document designed to make sure that whatever happens to this project, the Sinclair family keeps control and I keep the risk. I sat with that for a moment, understanding something I hadn't fully let myself consider until right then, that Isabel Marchetti wasn't the woman who'd taken my life. She was the next woman standing exactly where I'd once stood, 26 years earlier, being handed a document by a man who'd never once expected her to read it closely. Isabel, I said, I need to ask you something, and I want you to really think before you answer. Has anyone in that family ever once asked what you actually want, instead of telling you what they need from you? She didn't answer right away. When she finally did, her voice had gone very small. No, she said, not once. I told her some of it then, not everything. Marcus would have my head for the parts I did tell her. But enough of the shape of what was coming that she understood clearly. She was standing near a building that was about to come down, whether she was inside it or not when it happened. I'm not asking you to testify against anyone, I told her. I'm asking you to protect yourself the way nobody in that family is ever going to protect you for you. Get your own lawyer. A real one, not one Desmond recommends. And Isabel, read every single document before you sign it. Every single one. That's the only piece of advice I have that actually would have changed my own life if someone had given it to me 26 years ago. Before she left, she asked me one more question, turning back at the door with her coat half-buttoned. Do you regret it? Marrying in, building all of it and getting none of the credit. I thought about the question honestly, the way I'd promised myself I'd think about every hard question this whole ordeal put in front of me. I regret staying quiet longer than I needed to, I told her. I don't regret what I built. I built something real, Isabel, whether or not my name was ever on the paperwork. What I regret is believing, for a long time, that silence was the price of being allowed to keep it. It isn't. It never was. I just hadn't met anyone yet who'd say that to me plainly, the way I'm saying it to you now. She nodded slowly, like she was filing the sentence away somewhere she intended to come back to. I don't know what I'm going to do yet, she admitted. About the engagement. About any of it. But I know I'm not signing that second document. Whatever else happens, I know that much. She left with my number saved in her phone and a promise to call her father that same night. I didn't know, sitting alone in my studio afterward, whether she'd actually walk away from the engagement or the deal or any of it. But I knew something had shifted in the foundation Desmond was standing on, and I knew he had absolutely no idea it had happened. The photographs arrived 4 days later, tucked into my studio's mail slot with no postage and no note. 3 of them, me locking up the studio at dusk, me getting into my car outside Renee's house, me sitting at Adele Merrick's kitchen table, visible through her front window, a photograph that told me, with a clarity that turned my stomach, that whoever had taken it had been close enough to see exactly who I'd been talking to. There was no threat written anywhere on them. That, I understood even before I called Marcus, was the entire point. Someone wanted me to know I was being watched and wanted to make sure there was no sentence I could hand a detective and call a crime. This is exactly the kind of thing that happens once people start getting scared, Marcus said, when I described them over the phone, his voice tighter than I'd heard it in weeks. I want you at my office tomorrow morning. I'm assigning protective surveillance to your address and Adele Merrick starting tonight, And Maggie, I need you to think hard about whether you're willing to keep going. I mean that. Nobody will think less of you if the answer is no. I thought about Adele Merrick's hands wrapped around a cooling mug of tea. I thought about a nephew showing up with power of attorney paperwork an elderly widower had no memory of signing. I thought about a document with my own name on it, notarized by a woman who had never actually notarized it. I'm not stopping, I said. Farah's investigators traced the photograph's printing paper to a big box store 40 minutes inland, a dead end on its own, but Marcus's team cross-referenced the timing against a name that had surfaced twice already in the Egret Cove land records. A property consultant named Dale Kessner, who did not appear anywhere on Sinclair Development Group's official payroll, but who had been paid through one of the same Delaware shell entities Farah's team had already flagged, a fee described in the company's books only as field services. He's the one who's been leaning on the holdouts, Marcus told me. Adele Merrick mentioned an unfamiliar man asking neighbors questions about her routine, months before anything official ever happened. I think we just found the piece that turns this from financial fraud into something a jury's going to find a lot harder to sit through calmly. I want to be honest with you about something. The photographs frightened me more than anything Desmond had said to my face in that kitchen, more than the motion Kessler had filed, more than the forged waiver itself. Fraud, I could fight with patience and paperwork. A stranger close enough to photograph me through a widow's front window felt like something else entirely, something that made me lie awake, calculating exits in my own rented condo, like I hadn't done since I was a much younger, much more frightened person. Renee insisted on staying with me for a week after that, sleeping on my pull-out couch with her phone charging on the nightstand between us, and I never once heard her complain about the arrangement. Even after the third night in a row, she woke up to me pacing the living room at 2 in the morning. You don't have to apologize for being scared, she told me, the fourth night, making us both tea we didn't really want. You just have to keep being scared and doing the next right thing anyway. That's not bravery canceling out the fear, Maggie. That's what bravery actually is. But it also told me something I needed to know, walking into whatever came next. Whoever was running the pressure campaign against Adele Merrick and her neighbors wasn't guessing anymore that someone had noticed the pattern. They knew. And men who resort to quiet intimidation instead of louder threats are usually men who understand, on some level, exactly how much they actually have left to lose. I had no idea, that night, just how much Desmond was about to decide he had left to lose, or that within a week, he'd walk into my own studio and offer me something far more dangerous than a threat. Here is what happened in the 6 weeks between that envelope on my porch and the day everything finally came to a courtroom, compressed the way it deserves to be compressed, because I promised you I wouldn't waste your time on every phone call and every sleepless night, only the ones that actually mattered. Adele Merrick agreed to give a formal statement to Marcus's investigators, and once she did, 3 more holdout families along the Egret Cove stretch came forward within days, each with a version of the same story, a lowball offer, a buried environmental report, an unfamiliar man asking quiet questions about their routines. One family, the Doyles, had very nearly signed away their home the year before, backing out at the last moment when their adult daughter, a paralegal, got suspicious of the appraisal numbers and insisted on a second opinion. I drove out to meet them myself, the same week I sat with Adele, and found Marion Teague standing on her porch before I'd even gotten out of the car, arms crossed, her daughter Aelina hovering protectively at her shoulder. We already told the investigators everything we know, Marion said, wary in a way I understood completely by then. I'm not here for the investigation, I told her. I'm here because I understand what almost happened to you, and I wanted you to hear from another person who almost lost her own footing to the same company that it wasn't your fault for almost trusting them. Something in Marion's shoulders came down slowly, and she waved me up onto the porch. Her daughter, it turned out, had caught the discrepancy almost by accident, a line item in the appraisal that didn't match the county's own flood zone records, filed away in a drawer for a graduate class assignment before it ever became the thing that saved her parents' house. I keep thinking about how close it was, Aelina told me, sitting on the porch steps while her mother made coffee neither of us really wanted. 1 semester later, if I'd already graduated and moved for a job somewhere else, I don't think anyone catches it in time. That's exactly the math men like Desmond Sinclair are counting on, I told her. That most families won't have a Lena in the room when it matters. You did more for your parents that afternoon than you probably understand yet. She looked at me for a long moment, something steadying in her face, and I understood I'd just watched another version of the same quiet, patient vigilance that had saved my own life pass itself down to someone 20 years younger than either of us. Victor Marchetti pulled his capital commitment from Egret Cove entirely, 3 weeks after Isabel's visit to my studio, citing unresolved due diligence concerns in a letter Kessler's office received on a Friday afternoon, which Farah's team obtained through a subpoena the following Monday. Without Marchetti's money, Desmond was suddenly a developer sitting on 4 years of accumulated land, half-built infrastructure debt, and no way to finish what he'd started. At exactly the moment his son's carefully arranged marriage of convenience stopped being either convenient or, as far as I could tell from the silence that followed, likely to happen at all. Desmond came to my studio himself, unannounced, the same week Marchetti's withdrawal letter arrived, the only time in this entire fight he ever approached me directly instead of through Kessler or through his son. He stood in my doorway in a different coat this time, no smirk, something almost like respect in his face, which frightened me more than his confidence ever had. "I think we got off on the wrong foot, Margaret," he said, settling into a client chair without being invited to. "I'd like to propose something more generous. $200,000 and a standing consulting retainer with the company, 5 years, paid whether you actually consult on anything or not. All I'm asking in exchange is that whatever inquiries are circulating right now quietly stop circulating." "You want me to call off an investigation I don't control," I said, "in exchange for money you're offering because you're scared, not because you suddenly respect what I built." Something flickered across his face, not quite anger, something closer to genuine surprise, the look of a man realizing, for the first time, that the woman across from him had stopped being a problem he understood how to price. "I've been doing this a long time," he said, quieter now. "I know when a fight isn't worth the cost of winning it outright. I'm offering you a graceful way out before this gets uglier than either of us wants it to be. You're offering me hush money, Desmond, dressed up as a courtesy, the same way you dressed up $40,000 as a settlement and a stolen equity stake as a family transition. I've spent 24 years learning to recognize your language. I'm not interested in the newest version of it." He left without the practiced composure he'd walked in with, and I understood, watching his car pull away from my studio for what I hoped would be the last time, that I had just handed him the first genuine fear he'd felt in this entire fight, not fear of losing money, but fear of a woman who could no longer be bought at any price he was willing to name. Isabel called off the engagement in early January. She never told me the details, and I never asked, but Renee heard through the same gossip channels that had once turned against me that the engagement had ended not with a fight, but with a quiet letter from Isabel's own attorney to Desmond's, informing him that Ms. Marchetti would not be proceeding with the marriage or any related financial arrangement, effective immediately. Nathaniel called me the night that letter arrived. I almost didn't answer. I'm still not entirely sure why I did. "It's all coming apart," he said, and his voice had a hollowness to it I hadn't heard since we were very young and very broke and frightened together. Before any of this, before Desmond, before the company, before either of us had learned to build the kind of careful silences that ended a marriage slowly instead of all at once. Isabel's gone. Marchetti's gone. My father hasn't spoken a full sentence to me in 4 days that wasn't about lawyers. "Maggie, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Is there any version of this where you don't finish what you've started?" "There was," I told him. "There was a version of this where you got the paperwork drawn up 11 years ago like you promised me, and none of the rest of it ever happened. That version doesn't exist anymore, Nathaniel. You didn't lose it to me. You lost it to a decision you made a long time before I ever called my brother." He didn't have an answer for that. I don't think there was one. Marcus called 2 days later with the news I'd been waiting 3 months to hear. The state's Economic Crimes Bureau, working alongside Farah's forensic findings, a Del Merrick statement, the Teague family's corroborating account, and a financial trail that now stretched across 4 counties and 3 shell entities, had enough to move. A hearing was set for the following Tuesday, not just on my divorce, folded now into a much larger emergency motion, but on an asset freeze that would touch every account Sinclair Development Group controlled. "One more thing," Marcus said, and I could hear something almost like warmth creeping into his voice for the first time in weeks. "I'm coming to that hearing myself. I know it's a Tuesday. I know it's a 2-hour drive. I'm coming anyway, Maggie, and there's a reason I want you to know about, because I don't believe in coincidences, and I don't want you thinking this one is anything but exactly what it looks like." "What reason?" "I'm retiring my commission that same weekend," he said. 32 years, active and reserve, done. There's a small ceremony Monday night at the base. I'll still be in dress uniform Tuesday morning because I haven't had time to change, and Maggie, I'm not going to apologize for what that's going to look like walking into that courtroom. Some things are allowed to be exactly as dramatic as they actually are. I drove up for that ceremony, the Monday night before, standing at the back of a base auditorium I had no real business being in, watching my brother stand at attention while a 2-star general read a citation that used words like distinguished and unimpeachable integrity, words that felt, watching him, exactly as accurate as they were supposed to sound and not 1 degree more generous than he'd earned. Afterward, in the parking lot, still in his dress blues, he hugged me the way he used to hug me when we were kids, and our father had been too stern about something at dinner, both of us needing, briefly, to just be siblings again instead of a prosecutor and his witness. "Tomorrow's for you," he said into the top of my head, the same way he'd said it when I was 9 and scared of a thunderstorm. "Everything after this is for you." I want to tell you about the morning of that hearing slowly, because I've replayed it more times than any other morning of my life, and I want you to have all of it the way I still have all of it. The Magnolia County Courthouse smelled the same way it always smelled: old wood, coffee, the particular hush of a building where people's whole lives get decided in 45-minute increments. Desmond sat at the respondents' table beside Nathaniel and Warren Kessler, and for the first time since that night in my kitchen, I saw something in his face that wasn't composure. It was the look of a man doing math he didn't like the answer to. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Naomi Reyes, alone, the way I'd sat alone at every hearing so far, because Marcus had asked me to let the room believe, right up until the last possible second, that I'd come this far with nothing but a junior attorney and my own nerve. At 9 o'clock, the bailiff called our case. And right as Judge Castellano lifted her gavel, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom opened with a sound that made every head in the gallery turn at once. My brother walked down the center aisle in his dress uniform, ribbons across his chest from 32 years most people in that room would never fully understand the weight of, flanked by 2 investigators from the Economic Crimes Bureau carrying sealed evidence drives. He did not hurry. He has never once, in his entire life, needed to hurry to make a room understand exactly who had just walked into it. I watched Warren Kessler's face when he recognized him. I watched the pen slip out of his hand. Marcus stepped past the bar, inclined his head to the judge with the exact correct measure of formality, and set a folder on the plaintiff's table beside mine. "Deputy Attorney General Marcus Ashford," he said, appearing on behalf of the state's Economic Crimes Bureau, in coordination with the plaintiff, Margaret Ashford Sinclair. Desmond's composure finally, completely broke. I watched him look between the uniform, his son, and his attorney's stricken face, and I watched the exact moment he understood, 24 years too late, that the quiet woman he'd handed an envelope to in her own kitchen had never once, in all that time, actually been alone. "Your Honor," Marcus said, connecting an evidence drive to the courtroom monitor, his voice carrying the specific, unhurried authority of a man who has done this 1,000 times and never once lost. Before this court addresses the dissolution of marriage before it, the state is filing an emergency motion for a full asset freeze against Sinclair Development Group and its principals, based on evidence of forged notarization, fraudulent conveyance, and a sustained pattern of predatory land acquisition, affecting at least 4 families along the Egret Cove corridor. Kessler was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, this is completely outside the scope of today's hearing." "It's not outside the scope," counsel, Marcus said, turning to face him directly for the first time. "It's the scope you should have been worried about 3 months ago." Desmond rose halfway out of his chair, color climbing up his neck, some deeply buried instinct telling him, correctly, that silence had never once failed him before and might be the only thing that could still save him now. "Your Honor, I've built this county's coastline for 40 years. "Mr. Sinclair, sit down," Judge Castellano said, without raising her voice, in a tone that made the whole gallery go still. "You'll have every opportunity to respond through counsel. Right now, I'd like to see what the state has brought me." Desmond sat slowly, and for the first time since I'd known him, I watched him look genuinely unsure of what to do with his own hands. Judge Castellano looked at the screen, then at Desmond, then back at the screen, and I watched her expression sharpen with every passing second the way I imagine mine had, months earlier, reading a forged document at Renee's kitchen table for the first time. "Mr. Kessler," she said, "I'd suggest you and your client take this very seriously. Because from where I'm sitting, this looks like the difference between the case you thought you were arguing this morning and the one you're actually about to be arguing." Kessler asked for a recess to confer with his client, and Judge Castellano granted 20 minutes, and in that 20 minutes I watched something in the gallery I hadn't expected to see. Owen stood up from his seat near the back. He'd come after all, slipping in quietly once he heard from Renee where the hearing had been moved, and walked, not toward his grandfather, but toward me, sitting down heavily in the chair beside mine like his legs had made the decision on their own. "Is this real?" he asked, low enough that only I could hear it. "The forgery, the families, all of it." "Every word," I said. "I'm sorry you're hearing it here instead of from me first. I couldn't risk it reaching your grandfather before today." He sat with that for a long moment, staring at the emptied respondents' table where Kessler and Desmond had gone to confer. "I quit this morning," he said finally, "before I even knew any of this. Something about the Kessner payments finally didn't sit right, and I told Grandpa I needed time away from the company to think. I didn't know it would end up looking like I timed it for you. I promise you I didn't know." "You didn't need to time anything," I told him, and I felt something in my chest loosen for the first time in months, watching my son sit in that gallery choosing, on his own, before he even had the full picture, to step back from a loyalty that had never once been fully earned. You just needed to trust what you were already starting to see. When Kessler and Desmond returned, 20 minutes later, Judge Castellano read her ruling into a courtroom that had, without either of them noticing, already lost one more person who mattered. Judge Castellano spent the better part of an hour reviewing what Marcus's team put in front of her, and I want to tell you that I sat through every minute of it perfectly still, hands folded on the table, because 24 years of being underestimated had taught me exactly how to hold a room's attention by giving it nothing to react to. She started with Paula Winslow's notary log, laid side by side with the waiver bearing my forged signature, the dates simply, undeniably not matching. She moved to the money. Farah's team had followed it, patiently, out of the company's accounts and into a project fund for Egret Cove. Then she read from sworn statements. Adele Merrick, the Teague family, the same pattern each time, a lowball offer, a buried inspection report, an unfamiliar man asking quiet questions about their routines, a man named Dale Kessner whose fees lined up, almost to the week, with when each of them started feeling watched. Warren Kessler tried, twice, to argue that the land acquisitions were legitimate business practice, that difficult negotiations weren't the same as fraud, that his client had simply been a shrewd developer in a competitive market. Judge Castellano let him finish both times, which I understood, watching her face, was its own kind of mercy, giving a man enough rope to see exactly how it looked once he'd finished tying it. "Mr. Kessler," she said, the second time, "I've practiced law in this county for 31 years, and I have never once seen a shrewd business practice require a forged notary seal to remove an inconvenient family member from a company's cap table. I'm not interested in relitigating your client's negotiating style. I'm interested in whether he broke the law, and on the evidence in front of me, that question isn't close." When she finally looked up, her ruling came fast and complete, the way I imagine a held breath finally leaves a room. "This court finds sufficient evidence of fraud, forgery, and a documented pattern of predatory conduct to grant an immediate freeze on all assets held by Sinclair Development Group and its named principals, pending further investigation." The spousal waiver purportedly executed by Margaret Ashford Sinclair is void as fraudulently notarized and shall have no legal effect. The court further awards the petitioner an equitable interest in Sinclair Development Group, commensurate with her documented contributions to its operation over the past 11 years, to be finalized following a full forensic accounting. I am referring all evidence of forgery, fraudulent conveyance, and land acquisition, fraud directly to the Attorney General's Office for Criminal Review, effective immediately. I didn't cry in that courtroom. I want you to know that, because I think it matters, not because tears would have been weak, but because I had spent 3 months building toward a moment where nobody in that room could say I'd won on emotion instead of evidence, and I wasn't about to hand Desmond Sinclair that story after everything it had cost me to take it away from him. I cried later, in Marcus's car in the parking garage, my forehead against my own knees, 3 months of held breath finally leaving my body all at once. "You did that," my brother said, one hand steady on my back, still in his dress uniform, ribbons catching the fluorescent light. "Not me. I just carried the folder. You're the one who called me in the first place instead of signing that envelope, and you're the one who spent 3 months letting them believe you'd already lost, so we'd have time to actually build something real. That's not luck, Maggie. That's exactly who you've always been. It just took this long for the right room to see it." I thought, sitting in that parking garage, that the hardest part was finally behind me. I had no idea that the ruling itself was only the first domino, or how many other people's lives, including my own son's, were about to come down with it. The weeks after that ruling moved faster than anything that had come before them, the way a dam doesn't fail slowly once the first real crack finally opens. Desmond Sinclair was arrested 11 days later, charged with forgery, fraudulent conveyance, and a coordinated scheme to defraud property owners across 4 counties. He posted bond within hours, his attorneys arguing successfully against flight risk given his age and roots in the community. But the mugshot ran in the county paper anyway, above the fold, the same composed face that had told me I couldn't afford a lawyer now looking. For the first time in the years I'd known him, genuinely uncertain of what was coming next. Dale Kessner was charged separately for the intimidation campaign against Adele Merrick and her neighbors, and it was his cooperation, once his own attorney recognized how thin his position actually was, that filled in the last gaps in the case. Marcus let me sit in from behind a one-way mirror on the second of Kessner's interviews with Farah's team, not something he'd normally allow, he told me, but he thought I'd earned the right to see it, and I think, looking back, he also thought I needed it. The same way I'd needed to see Desmond's face in that courtroom instead of just hearing about his arrest secondhand. Kessner was younger than I'd pictured, maybe 40, in a golf polo that made him look like he'd been pulled off a course rather than out of an interrogation. He didn't fight the evidence long. Farah laid the field services payments in front of him, month by month, alongside dated notes from Adele Merrick and the Teague family describing an unfamiliar man asking careful, patient questions about their routines, and I watched something in his shoulders give out within the first 10 minutes. Desmond called it softening the ground, Kessner said, staring at the table. Find out when they are alone, when their kids visit, whether they've got a lawyer already or whether they are the type who'd never think to get one. He never told me to threaten anybody outright. He just made it real clear what result he wanted and left the how up to me. Did he ever mention Margaret Sinclair specifically? Farah asked. Kessner was quiet for a moment. After the divorce started getting complicated, he wanted to know her schedule, said she was asking around and he wanted to know who she was talking to. He looked up, and for the first time, something like shame crossed his face. I took those photos of her myself. I want that on the record. Nobody told me to leave them without a note. I did that on my own because I wanted her scared enough to stop before it got worse for me too. I sat behind that glass with my hands pressed flat against my own knees, and I understood, watching a man half Desmond's age describe his own small, deliberate cruelty so plainly, that fear really had been the entire architecture of how this family operated. Fear dressed up as business. Fear dressed up as concern. Fear handed down from an 81-year-old patriarch to a 40-year-old contractor to, however briefly, me, in my own kitchen, the night this all began. It didn't stay architecture for long after that interview. Kessner's cooperation agreement was finalized within the week, and it was his testimony, more than any single financial record, that convinced Desmond's own attorneys a trial was a fight they couldn't win. Sinclair Development Group's remaining assets, frozen and then subjected to full forensic accounting, revealed a company far more overextended than even Marcus's team had initially estimated. 4 years of Egret Cove infrastructure spending against a capital base that had evaporated the moment Victor Marchetti withdrew. Propped up in the final year by exactly the kind of predatory land acquisitions that had just become the centerpiece of a criminal case. Within 2 months, the company filed for bankruptcy, its remaining developable land placed into receivership, a portion of it eventually earmarked, at the state's insistence, for restitution to the families it had been taken from. 31 employees lost their jobs when the company finally folded, people who'd had nothing to do with Egret Cove, nothing to do with Kessner or the forged waiver, ordinary people who'd simply worked for a man they believed was building something legitimate. I thought about them more than I expected to, in the weeks the bankruptcy proceedings played out, and I made a point, through Renee, of quietly passing word to 2 local firms that were hiring, because I understood by then, better than almost anyone, what it felt like to have your livelihood destroyed by a decision you never got to make. I thought the company's collapse was the worst of what was coming. I was wrong. The hardest part of that spring wasn't watching Sinclair Development Group fold, it was watching what it did to the 2 men who'd built it, once each of them had to answer, separately, for exactly how much they'd known. Nathaniel's role in all of it existed in the space between conspirator and coward, and the plea negotiations that followed reflected exactly that uncertainty. He hadn't ordered the intimidation campaign. He hadn't directly forged the notary seal, though the evidence eventually showed he'd known, within weeks, that the waiver he'd asked me to sign at my aunt's kitchen table wasn't the cleanup paperwork he'd claimed it was. What he had done, knowingly, was allow a fraudulent document to stand between me and 24 years of equity, and tip off his father the moment investigators started circling, understanding by then exactly what that tip would set in motion. He pled guilty to a single count of fraudulent conveyance 3 months after the hearing, in exchange for cooperation against his father and Dale Kessner. I sat in the 3rd row of that courtroom, Owen beside me, and watched my husband of 24 years stand at a table in a suit I recognized from our younger son's christening, and say the word guilty in a voice that barely made it past his own teeth. Judge Castellano read the plea agreement into the record slowly, deliberately, and when she looked up at Nathaniel over her glasses, something in her expression made the whole gallery go still. "Mr. Sinclair," she said, "I want to note for the record that the leniency reflected in this agreement is attributable to your victim's stated preference, not to any mitigating quality in the conduct itself. Allowing a fraudulent document to strip your wife of 24 years of documented labor, and then alerting your father the moment investigators began circling, is one of the more calculated breaches of trust this court has reviewed this year. You should understand exactly whose grace you're standing on today, and I'd encourage you not to need it again." Nathaniel didn't look back at our row when they finished the paperwork. I don't think he could. The sentence, when it came, was 2 years probation, a substantial restitution order, and a felony record that would follow him for the rest of his life. No prison time. I hadn't asked for prison time, and I want to be honest with you about why, because I think it's the part of this story people understand the least. The district attorney's office, coordinating with Marcus's bureau, invited me in 3 weeks before Nathaniel's plea was finalized, to ask what outcome I wanted for the man I'd been married to for 24 years. I sat across from a young prosecutor named Simone Alvarez, Marcus beside me, and I told her something I'd been turning over since the night Nathaniel called me hollow-voiced, watching everything come apart around him. "I don't want him destroyed," I said. "I want him held accountable for exactly what he did, not what his father did, not what Kessner did, what Nathaniel actually chose with his own hands when he asked me to sign that waiver and then let it stand once he understood what it was. I think there's a version of justice here that makes him answer for that fully, without me being the reason our sons visit their father in a facility for the next decade." Marcus shifted in his seat beside me, and I could tell he wanted to say something, so I let him. "For what it's worth," he said, "I've sat across from a lot of victims in rooms like this one in 20 years of doing this work. Most of them want the person who hurt them to feel exactly as small as they were made to feel. It's a completely human thing to want, and nobody in this room would judge you for wanting it. What I've also learned over 20 years is that the victims who ask for proportionality instead of maximum punishment are very often the ones who end up actually healing faster, because they're not spending the next decade tracking a sentence like it's supposed to fill a hole it was never going to fill. Alvarez studied me for a long moment. "That's a more measured position than I usually hear in this chair," she said. "For the record, here's roughly what that looks like in practice. If his cooperation holds, probation rather than incarceration, a restitution schedule tied to whatever equity share the civil court eventually awards you, and mandated financial ethics course you work," which I know sounds almost comically insufficient given what he did, but which existing case law makes genuinely difficult to avoid attaching to a plea like this one. I wanted more than that. The first week, I told her honestly. I wanted all of them to lose everything, the way I'd been made to feel like I was losing everything. But I've spent 3 months learning what real damage looks like. Adele Merrick's cottage, the Doyles nearly losing a home 4 generations deep, Dale Kessner photographing an elderly widow through her own window because a man decided her land was worth more than her peace of mind. Nathaniel hurt me terribly, but he isn't the architecture of this. His father is. I'd like the system to reflect that difference if it can. We'll factor that into the plea framework, Alvarez said. I can't promise outcomes with Desmond. That case is bigger than any preference you or I have. But for what it's worth, this kind of clarity from a victim usually makes these cases stronger, not weaker. Vengeful witnesses make for messy trials. Clear-eyed ones make for pleas that actually hold. I want to tell you about one more phone call before I move on, because it happened in the middle of all this, and it steadied me more than almost anything else that spring. My Aunt Corinne, my late mother's younger sister, 91 years old and sharper than most people half her age, called me the week after that meeting with Alvarez, having heard the broad strokes of everything from Marcus. I want you to know something, she said, in the particular unhurried way she's always talked, like she has never once in her life felt rushed by anyone. Your mother would have been furious at that man. Not sad. Furious. She had a temper under all that southern politeness, your mother, and I think you got more of it than you've ever let yourself use. I'm glad to see you finally using some of it. I don't feel furious most days, I told her honestly. Mostly I just feel tired. That's what furious looks like after it's had time to get organized, Corinne said. Don't mistake the quiet for the absence of the fire, sweetheart. I've been alive long enough to know the difference. I sat with that on my porch after we hung up, watching the light go gold over the marsh, and I understood she was right in a way I hadn't fully let myself see yet. The fury hadn't left. It had simply learned patience, the way I'd been teaching it patience since the night Desmond first set that envelope on my counter. Desmond's case did not resolve as quietly. Facing charges that could carry a decade or more, and evidence that included Dale Kessner's cooperating testimony, Adele Merrick's statement, the Teague family's corroboration, and a financial trail Farah's team had built brick by patient brick. His attorneys eventually recommended a plea rather than risk a trial in front of a jury that would hear, in detail, exactly how his company had treated an elderly widow whose husband built her porch with his own 2 hands. He pled guilty to forgery, fraudulent conveyance, and a coordinated scheme to defraud, 5 months after that hearing, on a gray Tuesday in April. I thought, walking into his sentencing hearing, that I already knew every version of Desmond Sinclair there was to know. I didn't. There was one more, and it came out only when Adele Merrick stood up to speak. The sentencing hearing allowed victim impact statements, and I gave mine, short, factual, the kind of statement Marcus had helped me shape to carry weight without spectacle. But the one I'd waited 5 months to hear was Adele Merrick's. She stood at the podium in a cardigan her late husband had bought her for an anniversary decades earlier. According to the story she told me once over tea, and she didn't read from notes. I'm 74 years old, she said. I taught 3rd grade in this county for 31 years, buried my husband 9 years ago, and never once in my whole life thought a man in a nice suit could take my home out from under me with a stack of paperwork and a stranger following me to the grocery store. I held on for 2 years by myself, because I believed, most days, that I was the only fool left on that road too stubborn to take a bad deal. I didn't know until this year that I wasn't foolish at all. I was just up against something bigger than one old woman was ever meant to fight alone. She paused, and I watched her find Desmond's eyes across the courtroom and hold them there, steady, the way she'd held mine the first afternoon I sat at her kitchen table. "I wanted on the record that it was never my fault," she said. "It was his. He built a business on the assumption that people like me would rather lose everything quietly than make noise about it. I'd like this court to know that some of us, it turns out, were only ever waiting for someone to show up and make the noise alongside us." Desmond sat through all of it with the same composed posture I'd watched him carry into my kitchen a year earlier. And for a long stretch of that hearing, I genuinely believed nothing was going to reach him. He'd built a 40-year career on believing himself smarter than the rooms he walked into, and even facing 11 possible years, some stubborn, well-tailored part of him seemed to be waiting for a version of events where his composure was still the thing that won. It was Adele's line about him, never once having to look anyone in the eye, that finally landed. I watched him turn, briefly, and meet her gaze from across the courtroom, and something passed over his face that wasn't quite shame. Closer, I think, to the first real understanding he'd allowed himself in this entire process. That the machine he'd built specifically to keep his own hands clean had, in the end, required him to underestimate exactly one family too many. Judge Castellano, presiding over sentencing as well, handed down 11 years, with a restitution order that would follow Desmond Sinclair for the rest of his working life. The bulk of his remaining assets seized and redirected toward the families whose land had funded a resort that would now never be built. Dale Kessner received 4 years for his role in the intimidation campaign, the harshest sentence of the 3 men, because unlike Desmond and Nathaniel, he had no long relationship with any of his victims to weigh in the balance, and no family in the gallery asking the court for restraint on his behalf. Marion and Elena Teague sat 2 rows behind us, and I watched Marion reach over during Adele's statement to grip her daughter's hand the exact same way Adele gripped mine. A small, silent chain of women who had each, in their own turn, refused to let this particular kind of quiet cruelty go unanswered. Isabel sent a card that arrived the following week, no return address, just 3 lines in careful handwriting. I read every word of the coverage. "I'm glad you were the one he underestimated. Thank you for what you taught me before I understood I needed it." Adele Merrick squeezed my hand so hard in that courtroom, I felt it for a week afterward. "He deserved every second of that," she said, once we were out on the courthouse steps in the cold spring light. "Every single second, and I intend to enjoy every one of them from a distance." I didn't disagree with her. I don't think I ever will. But a sentencing hearing isn't the same thing as an ending, and there was still one relationship in this story I hadn't finished untangling, the one with my own son, who was waiting for me at my kitchen table the following week with a question I wasn't sure, at the time, that I had the right answer to. Owen came to see me the week after his grandfather's arraignment, sitting at my new kitchen table with the particular stillness of a young man carrying more guilt than he knew what to do with. "I worked there 6 years," he said. "I want to know how much of what I did actually helped him hurt people. The permits I processed, the appraisals I filed without double-checking them because he told me they'd already been reviewed. Mom, I need you to be honest with me. Was I part of this?" I thought about that question carefully because he deserved an honest answer more than he deserved comfort. "You trusted a grandfather who spent your whole life earning that trust in every way except the ways that turned out to matter most," I told him. "You didn't forge anything. You didn't threaten anyone. But Owen, I think you're going to spend a long time now learning to ask harder questions before you trust someone completely. And I think that's going to make you better at whatever you do next, even though it doesn't feel like a gift right now." "I got a job offer," he said quietly. "A property management firm 2 towns over. Smaller. Honest, as far as I can tell, I checked everything about them twice before I even sent a resume, which is new for me." He almost smiled. "I start next month. I wanted you to be the first person I told." "I'm proud of you," I said, and meant it more completely than I think I'd ever meant those 3 words in his entire life, because I understood, watching him say it, that my son had done something far harder than losing a job. He'd chosen, on his own, to walk away from the version of himself that Desmond had spent 6 years quietly building and start over as someone he'd actually chosen to become. Claire flew in from Charlotte the same weekend, and the three of us had dinner together at my new table for the first time since any of this started. No Nathaniel, no Desmond. Just my 2 children and me, eating takeout out of the containers because I hadn't unpacked the good dishes yet, laughing at something Owen said about his old office that wouldn't have been funny 4 months earlier and was, somehow, exactly the right kind of funny now. You know what I keep thinking about, Claire said, halfway through the meal, is that Grandpa Desmond spent 30 years teaching Owen that the Sinclair name was worth protecting at any cost, and it took you about 4 months to teach him it wasn't the name that mattered at all. She looked at me, something fierce and proud in her face that reminded me, unexpectedly, of my own father. I don't think either of them ever figured out what you were actually made of, Mom. Not once. In 26 years. Nathaniel and I didn't speak for the better part of 4 months after his plea. I needed that distance, and I think, honestly, he did too, needed to sit with what he'd done without me in the room to soften any part of it for him, the way I'd spent 24 years softening things for him, without ever fully realizing that's what I'd been doing. We spoke again in early summer, at Owen's graduate certificate ceremony for the property management coursework he'd started after leaving his grandfather's company. Both of us circling each other carefully across a lawn full of gowns and proud parents, until he finally came and sat beside me on a bench near the edge of the ceremony while our son posed for photos with his friends. Nathaniel looked older than I remembered him looking even a year earlier, thinner, a little gray at the temples he'd always dyed before. The particular deflation of a man who has stopped performing confidence because there's finally no one left worth performing it for. I don't know how to start apologizing for something this size, he said. I've tried writing it a dozen times. It always sounds like excuses even when I'm trying not to make any. Then don't write it, I told him. Just tell me the truest thing you understand right now, today, about what you actually did. He was quiet for a long moment, watching our son laugh at something across the lawn. I stopped thinking of you as someone who could say no, he said finally. Somewhere along the way, I started thinking of what you'd built as something that was eventually going to belong to the company anyway, so it didn't feel like stealing to just speed that up. That's insane, saying it out loud. You were a person the entire time. I just stopped acting like I remembered that. It wasn't a full accounting. I don't think it will ever be entirely full. But it was the truest thing he'd said to me since that Tuesday in October, and I felt something in my chest ease, slightly, for the first time in almost a year. I'm not going to pretend this is healed, I told him. It might not be, not completely, for a very long time. But I'm not disappearing from our sons' lives because their father made a choice I have to live with the consequences of. We're going to have to figure out what this looks like on the other side of unforgivable if we want anything at all. That's going to take longer than either of us wants it to. He nodded and didn't push for more, which I took as its own small, imperfect sign of growth. Isabelle Marchetti, I heard eventually through Renee's endlessly reliable gossip network, went on to finish her MBA and take a position at her father's firm, where, according to the one email she sent me, 8 months after that evening in my studio, she'd made it a personal policy, in every deal she reviewed, to read every single document twice before anyone else in the room finished their coffee. Thank you for telling me the truth when you had nothing to gain from it, she wrote. I don't think I'll ever be handed a document again without hearing your voice asking me what it actually says. She came to see me in person once more, almost a year after that evening outside my studio, stopping through Magnolia Bay on her way to a business trip she didn't fully explain. We had coffee at a place near the marina, and she looked different, steadier, older in the way that has nothing to do with years. A woman who had clearly spent the last 12 months learning to read every line of every document she was ever handed again. I wanted to see you finish something, she said, a little sheepishly, since I only ever saw you in the middle of falling apart. You don't look like that woman anymore. Neither do you, I told her, and I meant it as the compliment it was intended to be. Watching her stir her coffee with the calm, unhurried confidence of someone who had stopped waiting for anyone else's permission to take up space in a room. I'd spent a year rebuilding other people's trust in me one conversation at a time. What I hadn't expected was how much of my own life was still waiting to be rebuilt right alongside it. Ashford and Foster had its best year in the firm's history, the spring after Desmond's sentencing. And I don't think that's a coincidence, even though I'd never say it out loud at a client dinner. There's something people respond to in a woman who was tested publicly and didn't fold, even if most of them would never say so to my face in quite those words. The grocery store had changed too, in its own small way. I ran into Carol Whitmore, the same woman who'd once told me, gently and cruelly, that this whole mess might be a wake-up call about what really mattered, in the cereal aisle a few weeks after Desmond's sentencing made the front page. And she stopped me with a hand on my arm, her face doing something complicated I didn't have the energy to fully forgive yet. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I said some things last year I shouldn't have said before I understood the shape of any of it. I'm sorry, Maggie. I hope you know I never would have said them if I'd known the truth." "I know," I told her, and I meant it mostly, though I also didn't linger in that aisle any longer than I needed to, because some friendships, I've learned, survive being tested, and some simply reveal what they were always made of. I put my cereal in my cart and went home, and I didn't think about Carol Whitmore again for a long time after that. Delphine Aldrich's granddaughter's wedding, that spring, was the finest event the firm had ever produced, an evening under old oaks strung with lights, Renee running logistics with the calm precision of someone who'd earned every ounce of the trust I'd placed in her, Adele Merrick seated at a table near the dance floor because I'd insisted, months earlier, that she come as my guest to the first genuinely joyful thing I'd been part of in over a year. Claire flew in for it too, and Owen came straight from his new job in his one good suit, and for a few hours that evening, watching my children laugh with Renee under a string of borrowed lights, I let myself simply enjoy being exactly where I was, without doing the math on what it had cost to get there. "Nice place," she said, looking around the venue, the same dry warmth in her voice I'd first heard across her kitchen table. "It's mine," I told her, and I watched her understand exactly what I meant by that sentence, because she was the one person at that table who understood its full weight better than almost anyone alive. "Damn right it is," she said, and raised her glass, and I raised mine back. There was still one debt in this story I hadn't fully repaid, not in money, but in the 2 stubborn years I'd let slip past before I ever picked up the phone in the first place. Marcus and I talk every week now, sometimes twice, the 2-year silence between us having burned away completely somewhere in the middle of everything that followed my phone call from that kitchen. He retired fully from the bureau 18 months after Desmond's sentencing, took a slower consulting role 2 counties over, and comes down to Magnolia Bay most Sunday afternoons now, sitting on my porch with a glass of sweet tea, needling me gently about how long it took me to finally use his phone number for something other than a birthday text. "You could have called me any time in those 2 years," he told me once, not unkindly. "I know," I said. I was too proud, and too embarrassed, and too tired of everyone deciding who I was before I'd said a word. "I'm still working on the proud part." "Good," he said. "Keep working on it. Just don't let it cost you another 24 years next time." Claire calls every Sunday still, without fail, usually while she's driving home from a shift, and most weeks we don't talk about any of this at all anymore. We talk about her patients, her apartment, a man she's cautiously optimistic about, the ordinary texture of a daughter's life that I spent a year afraid I'd lose along with everything else. Sometimes, though, near the end of a call, she'll go quiet for a second and say something like, "I'm really glad you're okay, Mom." And I understand, every time, that she means something much larger than the sentence itself is carrying. I bought a house that winter, small, on a quiet street 2 blocks from my studio, entirely, unambiguously in my own name, closed with a check I wrote myself for money that was, for the first time in my adult life, indisputably mine on paper as well as in fact. I put the deed in a frame in my office, not out of vanity, but because I wanted to look at it some mornings and remember exactly what it had cost, and exactly who had helped me get it back. I think about that night in my old kitchen more often than I'd like to admit. Desmond's coat still buttoned, that envelope sitting between us like it was the only thing in the room that mattered. His voice so certain, so gentle, telling me I couldn't afford a lawyer to fight his son. He wasn't entirely wrong, in the strictest sense. I couldn't afford a lawyer like Warren Kessler, billing by the hour for 30 years of practiced patience. What I had instead was something no amount of money could have bought him back, a brother I'd spent 2 stubborn years refusing to lean on, a name I'd spent 24 years hiding out of pride I'm still learning to set down gently instead of all at once, and a quiet I'd let an entire family mistake for surrender. I've had 2 years now to sit with all of it, long enough for the anger to settle into something steadier, something closer to clarity than rage. I don't wake up thinking about that kitchen every morning anymore. Some mornings, I think about the porch I sit on now instead, coffee going cold, while I watch the light come up over my own small, unremarkable, entirely mine backyard, and I understand that this is what the other side of a thing like this actually looks like. Not a triumphant final scene. Just an ordinary Tuesday in a life nobody gets to take from me again. I think Desmond believed, right up until the moment those courtroom doors opened, that quiet women were simply women who hadn't been pushed hard enough yet to fight back. He built an entire career on that belief, and it cost him everything in the end because he never once considered the other possibility, that some of us go quiet not because we've given up, but because we're listening and counting and waiting for the exact moment the truth will do more damage arriving all at once than it ever could arriving in pieces. I don't know what happened to the envelope Desmond left on my counter that night. I think Renee threw it away weeks later, once it stopped mattering, once it became just paper again instead of the hinge my entire life turned on. I still drive past the old house sometimes, the one with the garden I planted and the window over the sink, on my way to a client's appointment across town. New people own it now, a young family, from what I can tell, with a swing set in the backyard where my rose bushes used to be. I thought it would hurt more than it does. Mostly it just feels like looking at a photograph of a person I used to be, someone I recognize completely and would never trade places with again. I think about Adele Merrick's porch, too, the one her husband built board by board the summer before he died, still standing on that bluff because a woman old enough to know better decided to be as inconvenient as humanly possible rather than let it go quietly. I think about Elena Teague, 24 years old, catching a discrepancy in an appraisal almost by accident and saving her parents' home without ever fully understanding, at the time, what she'd actually done. I think about my son choosing, on his own, before he even had the full picture, to walk away from a loyalty that had never once been fully earned. None of us were owed the outcome we got. We simply refused, each in our own way, to make it easy for the people counting on our silence. But I still think about the word I said to Desmond right before he left, the one I'd kept locked away in this family for 24 years out of a pride that cost me almost everything before it finally saved me. Brother. It's a small word to carry that much weight. But I've learned, in the 2 years since that Tuesday in October, that the people who love us quietly, patiently, without needing credit for it, are very often the only ones capable of showing up exactly when we finally stop being too proud to ask. If you've made it this far with me, I hope you'll consider subscribing to Revenge Lab, because I have a feeling you're exactly the kind of person who understands what it means to stay quiet on purpose. And I'd love for you to be here the next time someone finally stops being quiet for good. My father-in-law once told me, standing in my own kitchen, that I couldn't afford a lawyer to fight his son. He was right, I couldn't. I had something he never once thought to price correctly: a brother, a truth, and 24 years of patience that finally ran out at exactly the right moment to matter.